we go back to Russia's involvement in Afghanistan, the thing that pushed Russia to leave Afghanistan was the mothers of the soldiers, because there were so many body bags coming back. It was less than 50,000. It was significantly less than the casualties that are coming back today. So that level of pressure hasn't built up yet. That's an indication of the level of control that Vladimir Putin's got over the information operation domestically, and his ability to influence the Russian thinking in that this is an existential conflict against NATO, protecting Russia and Russia's very existence. That can only last for a certain period of time. But then looking at more practical issues, you highlighted it there in that we're getting more migrants coming in. We're getting more overseas troops coming in. We've got Vladimir Putin and his Wagner group recruiting in Africa and getting African troops in. We've seen the deal that he's done with North Korea to get North Korean troops in. The African troops are very, very poorly trained, if at all. The North Korean troops are highly trained, but have got zero combat experience whatsoever and work in a very serialized environment. But if he's having to turn to places like that to get manpower, to get him some form of experience, that suggests that he's in real difficulties. He can get as many other individuals, give them a couple of weeks or a couple of days training on how to use an AK-47 or different variants of it and shove them into the front line, and they will just be decimated, as they are being at the moment. It is a meat grinder, and that is something that is relentless to the Ukrainians, because they can see the attacks coming in and they can see that they're killing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of human beings on a daily basis, and that will have a toll on the Ukrainians, and it's costing them as well. But nowhere near to the same sort of numbers. But we're in that attritional warfare phase at the moment, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold the Russians back until they can build up their capability that's been promised by the West for so long, and then start to have a greater effect on the front line as well as elsewhere.
I take your distinction between not describing the offensive as a failure, maybe describing it as not being successful. But I mean, there will be people who say, given the delay in Western military aid, given the issues that Ukraine have had with mobilization as well, it is surprising that Russia haven't been able to take more territory so far in 2024. Why is that?
Yeah, it's very surprising. If you look at Russian tactics, what they seem to be doing is penny packeting their military troops on the ground. They're sending one or two tanks, maybe a maximum 10, 15 tanks into a particular attack. That's a big attack. That's, a company group level attack. We'd expect the Russians to be coming in with regimental or divisional level of attacks to have an effect, to concentrate the force on the Ukrainian front line and punch through. That tells me they don't have the command and control capability to do that. They don't have the equipment to do that. They don't have the trained manpower to do that, because it's really quite complex. And we're seeing their aircraft flying in support, but not coordinated completely with what's going on the ground. So everything is happening sort of randomly across the front line under different commands, but not being coordinated. And that's the principal reason why the Russians are not having an effect. They haven't got that ability to coordinate an all arms and a combined effort to attack one or two weak points on the Ukrainian front line and punch the way through. If they could do that, the Ukrainians are under pressure, and the Russians could punch the way through and have a greater effect. But the Ukrainians seem pretty well prepared from a defensive perspective, and are holding them off. A lot of the repairs that should have been done to Russian equipment and naval vessels are very complicated, haven't been done. But those individuals, admirals and others responsible for it, have taken the cash for that. Corruption has been rife in the logistics support across the Russian military, their army, but also into their navy and into their air force, which is why we're not seeing decisive action by the Russian air force. And then when it comes to training, the Russians are very good at putting little displays on and going out and sail a little group of ships up and down to do a few things. But a lot of their training regimes are scripted. So whenever the senior officer is there visiting, whenever the senior politician is there observing it, they have got set serials, between X time and Y time, 3 ships will steam in that direction, do a hard left turn and fire 3 missiles. And that's what they do. But that doesn't put it into the context of warfare, and it doesn't put it into the context of what the Ukrainians are exhibiting against them, irregular warfare or special operations executive type warfare. And the Russians had never prepared for sea drone attacks or anything else. They thought themselves invincible because of their might and because of their, in inverted commas, reputation. They had over-egged their own capabilities, and the Ukrainians knew that. They've trained closely with the Russians beforehand. Many of the Ukrainian officers have been to Russian Staff College and elsewhere. They are, some of them, family friends and connections with Russian officers. They know the psyche, but they also know the Western psyche. And the Ukrainians have been very clever and been able to combine the two together, look at the vulnerabilities and exploit those vulnerabilities.
Let's talk about the F-16 fighter jets. The mood music is that their arrival in Ukraine is imminent. Is it your sense, Philip, that the first we will know of them will be when they have carried out an attack?
I suspect that they're already the first ones. The Ukrainians will be training with them quite hard, trying to keep them protected. They will carry out one or two small operations with them just to give the pilots confidence in the airframe, the weapon systems, and everything else. The United States, I understand, have agreed to give the sophisticated weapons that are needed to turn the F-16 into the powerful platform that it is. But again, we're hearing, and this is only open source, that the Ukrainians have only got half a dozen of them. It's going to be a while before they get the mass that they need to have that effect. So what the Ukrainians will be looking at doing is trying to find an opportunity to use them in an amber situation to send a clear message to the Russians that, hey, they've arrived and we've got you and we've got the weapons, because that will have that psychological effect on the Russians' ability to protect their front line with their air forces and want to push their air forces even further back. It'll also put the Russian air defense systems onto a much higher level of alert. And that's not good for Russian pilots. I think Russian air defense has shot down almost as many Russian pilots as Ukrainian air defense has done as well, because, again, lack of training, lack of proper drills, lack of command and control. They see a target, they fire first and ask questions later.
I mean, the F-16s have been described sometimes as a game changer, but are you saying that, if they do only have a handful of them, and given the issues with training, that's probably overhyped for the time being at least?
In the early days, it's overhyped. They need to be able to create a mass. They need to be able to create a mass to provide at least local air superiority over an area of the battlefield where the Ukrainians want to have an effect on the ground and concentrate their armored forces and punch through the Russians. Until they get the masses to be able to do that, and that means being able to have almost a 24/7 close air support capability, and then a combat capability above that to keep the Russian Air Force back. That takes time, that takes mass, that takes training. So it's not something that I think is going to be here during this year, during 2024. It's something that the Ukrainians will be working up to in 2025. But the Ukrainians will also want to have pre-operations to destroy as many of the Russian Air Force as possible. So they'll try and force them out. And when they're confident that they can use the F-16s from as much of a standoff range as possible, and they've got the weapon systems, the missiles, the intelligence feeds and everything else to have that effect on the Russian air forces and destroy as many as possible in the air. That'll push the Russians even further back. They need to do that before they even contemplate supporting ground operations. So we've got a long way to go yet before we'll see the proper effect from the F-16s. And it takes the numbers, it takes the pilots trained. It takes the pilots trained not just in flying the aircraft. This is where people get really mixed up with it. Yes, you could probably put an experienced fast jet pilot into an F-16 and he can take it off and he can land it again if you're lucky. And he or she is lucky, but you can't fight it. And if you can't fight it, you'll die. It's too complicated.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.